Moving on, the need for journalists to be allowed to go about their duties freely without fear or favor of reprisals was the focus of the first Global Media Freedom Conference held in London last week. The event, which was co-hosted by the UK and Canadian governments, saw representation from other governments from around the world who collectively emphasized the need for a free media. The conversation comes at a time journalists, not only in Ghana but around the world, have come under increasing attacks, with some, such as Ahmed Hussein Swale of Tiger Eye PI, being murdered. UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, whilst condemning the attacks on journalists, highlighted why a free media is so critical.
Real accountability doesn't emerge from the selective and theatrical crackdowns on corruption mounted by authoritarian states, which mysteriously eliminate political opponents whilst leaving the biggest offenders untouched. Real accountability comes from the risk of exposure by a media that cannot be controlled or suborned. And the evidence for this is very clear. Of the 10 cleanest countries in the world, as ranked by Transparency International, 7 are also in the top 10 of the World Press Freedom Index. Meanwhile, of the 10 most corrupt countries, 4 are in the bottom 10 for media freedom. Now, powerful people value their reputations, so the sunlight of transparency is the greatest deterrent to wrongdoing. I'm a politician, and like many members of my profession, I don't always enjoy reading what the media says about me. Indeed, a politician who stands up for journalists might occasionally feel like a turkey voting for Christmas. And of course, I need to say, maybe my only chance, newspapers also make mistakes. Journalists are not immune from the temptations of hyperbole or excess. But for those of us who are sometimes on the receiving end of criticism, we should also reflect on the wisdom of Nelson Mandela, when he said, "The media are a mirror through which we see ourselves and others perceive us, warts, blemishes, and all. Such criticism can only help us to grow by calling attention to those of our actions and omissions which do not measure up to our people's expectations."
So Jeremy Hunt announced the UK government is committing £18 million to the Global Media Defence Fund to improve media freedom across the world, with Canada providing an additional $1 million. The fund will be administered by UNESCO. Well, Joy News editor Israel Laye was at the first Global Media Freedom Conference and joins me in the studio with a bit more on this. Now, the issue of press freedom has been topical in the past few days, particularly even in Ghana, with the stories about, you know, journalists whose offices were raided, the Modern Ghana journalists, and the like. Were some of these stories, did some of these stories come up during the conference?
Indeed, it did come up at the conference. We had Anas Aremia, Anas investigator. He addressed the plenary at a point, and he mentioned Ahmed Hussein Swale and Jamal Khashoggi came up. So we had all these issues coming up in the conversations. It turned out that if we have 10 journalists who are attacked, only one case is investigated.
Oh, wow, that's serious.
Of the 10 journalists that are killed, only one case is investigated. So I was actually surprised that the situation we're having in Ghana was not so different from what was happening around the world, because there were lots of examples from across the world that came up at this conference.
I see. And you know, recently the rankings, we had dropped on the global rankings, but what interventions are being made to ensure that we don't see incidences such as these?
So that's one of the reasons why this fund has been set up by the UK government, and they talk about defending journalists, including through supporting access to legal services, training journalists, including in personal safety, establishing peer support networks for freelance journalists, promoting citizen journalism, and supporting countries in developing national action plans. And of course, Ghana is one of those countries that is developing something of that sort to protect journalists. I had a conversation with our Information Minister, Kojo Nkrumah, who was also there at the conference. He talked about the fact that they're working on it, and by the end of this month, we should see a draft report. He also talked, this fund is also supposed to assist a high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom by funding its secretariat. And interestingly, one of the people who's in charge of this legal panel of experts is the UK Special Envoy on Media Freedom, who happens to be Amal Clooney.
Okay, so we can...
The institution and consistent use of sanctions regimes to impose serious financial consequences on state officials who abuse media freedom. Enhanced consular duties when a journalist is detained abroad. A system of visas for persecuted journalists seeking asylum. An international investigative team that can be deployed, that includes lawyers and forensic experts, and can be deployed when a journalist is attacked. And the promulgation of model legislation to guide states on the free speech guarantees that must be respected under international law.
Interesting. So that was Amal Clooney talking about that
So
fund.
she's talking about this fund and what they are doing at the international level, on a global scale. And I was asking, this looks like a fund that is going to be way up there. How do we, local journalists or journalists in Ghana, benefit from it? And it was a question I put to the Information Minister, Kojo Nkrumah. Again, he was saying that they were hoping that once they had put together the draft, they could approach them and tell them that this is what we intend, or this is what we're doing, and that's why we deserve funding from that. But I feel that beyond what has happened in London last week, it's important that we come together as journalists, ourselves, practitioners, to have a conversation and drive the conversation about defending media freedoms, because it's been done out there, and we also need to do it. And that's why I find it important that multimedia is taking up this challenge, that we're going to bring issues of media freedoms to the front burner, bring up all the issues, discuss it with the stakeholders so that we can find a way out. Otherwise, if we rest on these freedoms and our rights, before we know, we're actually being taken over.
Definitely, absolutely. But Israel, tell me, you've been there for how many days? 3 days, obviously enjoying yourself and, you know, taking in all the sights and sounds. But really, from this conference, what was your takeaway?
If I was excited, or the fact that we're actually having conversations about defending media freedoms, and that these conversations are being taken up on the global level, and we're having governments committing to supporting these causes. For me, I find it refreshing. And again, as I indicated, we shouldn't just leave the conversation there. We should return, now that we're back, we should continue the conversations, because we cannot let we cannot just look on as our rights are being trampled upon. And several of the speakers who spoke emphasized the fact that it is important that we have a free media. One of them is Chrystia Freeland, the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister.
The seeming paradox of elected politicians coming together to support a free press. We politicians may seem to be surprising champions for the media, and that's because of the inherent structural conflict between the press and the government. The job of journalists, after all, is to hold our feet to the fire. And as someone who is regularly on the receiving end of that treatment, I can assure you that it is not a very pleasant experience. And I'm sure all the politicians in this room are nodding in hearty agreement. But it would be a terrible mistake for any politician, smarting perhaps from that discomfort, to conclude that journalists are the enemy. Quite the contrary. A free and independent media, in all of its disputatious, cantankerous glory, is one of the cornerstones of liberal democracy. Reminding ourselves and each other of that fundamental reality is why it is so useful for us to come together today. Now, the truth is, to be sure, that it's harder to be a politician, to be a government in a country with a free and independent media. But that's the point. By holding us, their governments, accountable, journalists make us better than we would otherwise be.
And let us remember that a free and independent media is the cornerstone of any democracy. Let us guard it jealously. You're still watching Joy News Prime with me, Arba Kumsin. We're taking a break.